Hello and welcome to screencast number 9 for Chapter 20, Conventional Energy Alternatives. And I'm hoping that we can conclude this, so we're going to try to go through this one pretty quickly. The picture that you see here takes off from what we learned in the last screencast, and this is algae. They're storing up and they're producing algae. And then the next picture just represents that switchgrass that they were talking about that could be used for the cellulose fuels. So the next question that we have to ask is bioenergy carbon neutral? And in principle, yes, it releases no net carbon because photosynthesis removes carbon that is released when the biomass is burned. It's kind of like an equal input output, but burning biomass is not carbon neutral. So if we destroy forests to plant bioenergy crops, then we're taking away our natural recyclers, and that's putting more carbon back up into the atmosphere. If we have to use fossil fuel energy, like in our tractors or for fertilizers or pesticides, then we're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The Kyoto Protocol gives us incentives to destroy forest for biofuel crops, which is surprising. But only emissions from energy use, not land use changes, are counted towards these controlling of the emissions. So the next thing that we want to focus on is the hydroelectric power. I realize that the only thing this chapter doesn't talk about is solar energy. I think it did just a very little bit, but the last part is hydroelectric. And next to biomass, this provides more renewable energy than any other source. So hydropower uses the kinetic energy of moving water, and it turns turbines to generate the electricity. And there are three different approaches to hydropower. One is the storage technique, and this is where we build dams that block the flow of river water, and then it lets the water pass through the dam at a certain rate. So we're able to collect our energy there. The reservoir of water passes through the dam and it turns the blades of the turbine, and this causes the generator to generate electricity. And then that electricity is generated in a powerhouse of the dam and then transmitted to the electric grid for people to use. Another alternative approach is called the run of the river. And here's just some pictures of the dams and the turbines and how they're made. You can see the turbines in there. Okay, so the run of the river approach generates electricity without greatly disrupting the flow of river water. There are several different methods that can be used with this. One is actually to divert a portion of the river's flow through a pipe or channel, and as it passes through a powerhouse, it can then return to the river. This can be done with or without a small reservoir, and it only pulls the water temporarily. But the pipe or channel can be run along either the surface or underground, so there's a choice to that. Another method is to flow river water over a dam small enough not to impede fish passage. And this way you're going to get the fish to go back and forth. You can siphon off water to turn the turbines and then return the water to the river. The run of the river systems are useful in areas that are remote and don't have any really established electrical grids in their regions. So if they don't have economic resources to maintain the large dams, this is a good, useful way of controlling the water. And a better way to control the timing and the flow is through something known as pump storage. Water is pumped from a low reservoir to a high reservoir during times when the demand for power is weak and prices are low. When demand is strong and prices are high, water is allowed to flow downhill through a turbine and generate electricity. Although energy must be input to pump the water, pump storage can be profitable. when it's paired with intermittent sources such as solar and wind power, it can help balance the region's water and power supply. So the question then comes up. Here's an example of the run of the river that we were talking about before. Okay, so hydropower is clean and renewable, as you can imagine, but it also has some impacts that we don't always think about. There are three clear advantages over fossil fuels for this. One, it's renewable. As long as precipitation falls from the sky and the rivers have water and reservoirs, there's going to be water to turn the turbines. It's efficient. We're talking about an EROI ratio of 100 to 1. There's no carbon compounds that are burned. There are no carbon dioxide that is emitted. There's no other pollutants that are emitted into the atmosphere, and it actually helps to safeguard air quality, climate, and human health. The only time fossil fuels are going to be used will be in the construction of the dams and maintaining the dams. But recent evidence indicates that large reservoirs are releasing greenhouse gas, methane, as a result of anaerobic decay in the deep water. So that's something new that we didn't know before. But overall, the hydropower accounts for only a small fraction of greenhouse gas emissions typical from the fossil fuel combustion. So the negative impacts, and there are negative impacts. Damming the rivers destroy habitat for wildlife. They cause habitat fragmentation in areas above the dam sites, and they submerge areas that were once exposed to the sun. The sites that are often below the river are starved of water because the water discharges regulate to optimize the amount of energy that is going to be generated. The natural flooding cycles of the rivers are disrupted, and this suppresses any nutrients from being brought down from the floodplains. So the sediments become trapped behind the dams, and then they begin filling that reservoir, making it shallower. Dams also cause thermal pollution because the water downstream may be unusually warm since the water levels are kept unnaturally shallow, so that's a problem. They have tried periodic flushes of cold water to release the water from the reservoir, but this causes thermal shocks and causes habitat alteration, and has diminished or eliminated some of the native fish in many of the dammed waterways. So the dams generally block the passage of fish and other aquatic creatures, and it fragments again the river, and it reduces the biodiversity in those areas. So all of these ecological impacts generally translate into negative social and economic impacts for the local communities. As far as how much hydropower are we using for our energy supply, about 16% of the world's electricity comes from the hydro power. Nations with large amounts of river and water and economic resources build dams, and they have been the keystone of their development. So we're talking about places like Canada and Brazil, Norway and Austria and Switzerland and Venezuela. And we can't leave out Sweden because we've talked about Sweden quite a bit. They receive about 11% of the total energy. In 1980, there was a referendum to phase out the nuclear power plants, and many people had hoped hydropower would be the way that they would go. But Sweden had already dammed so many of its rivers that it couldn't gain too much additional hydropower by erecting more dams. And there were a lot of citizens who wanted to keep the remaining rivers undammed and preserved as natural as possible. There have been other countries, though, that have experienced dam building. Dam building in the United States began in the 1930s when the government constructed dams as public projects, partly to employ people and to help end the economic depression from that time. So U.S. dam construction peaked around 1960. We had about 3,123 dams that had been built in a single year. American engineers, after they slowed the damming projects here in the States, they took their expertise to different nations in the developing world. In India, the Prime Minister commented that in 1963, the dams were the temples of modern India. He was referring to the importance of the development of this energy capacity in his nation. So here are the states that produce the most hydropower. China and Brazil lead. Canada is up there as well, and United States ranks fourth with this. So there are massive construction projects going on in China. They just recently completed the Three Gorges Dam. This is the world's largest. The reservoir actually displaced about 1.3 million people, and the dam is now generating as much electricity as dozens of coal-fired plants are, or nuclear plants. But here's the problem with this. Most of the world's rivers have been dammed, limiting any potential for expansion. The main reason most of the world's large rivers that offer excellent opportunities for hydropower, since they're already dammed, people have grown more aware of the ecological impacts, and residents in some regions are resisting dam construction. So back to Sweden. The hydropower's contribution to the national energy budget has remained virtually unchanged for the last 40 years. In the U.S., 98% of our rivers are appropriate for dam construction, have been already dammed. The remaining 2% are protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So hydropower will likely continue to increase in developing nations that have yet to dam rivers, but in developed nations like our own, hydropower growth is slowing down. The International Energy Agency forecasts that hydropower's share of electricity generation will decline very slightly between now and 2035, whereas the share of other renewable energy resources will triple. Okay, I'm going to let you read this conclusion on your own, so take a few minutes to look this over. We're not going to do a question review. We're going to end here, and I hope you have a good one.